From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. It is the day we've all been waiting for as Americans who didn't vote earlier head to the polls throughout the country to vote for president, for Congress, and for a third of the United States Senate. To kick us off, we start with our Bloomberg reporters assigned to the campaigns, Mario Parker on the Trump campaign and Emily Wilkins covering the Biden campaign. So Mario, welcome. Good to have you with us. Give us a sense of what's going on within the Trump campaign today.
Well, the Trump campaign feels pretty confident. They're optimistic going into today. At least they're saying so publicly. But the president will soon be going over to HQ for the traditional kind of morale booster and also the usual kind of conclusion for the campaign. So he'll be visiting the HQ while they're making calls to voters and kind of just handing with some of the staffs there this morning. Later on tonight, the president is expected to have an event at the White House in the East Room, a watch party.
With 400 of his closest friends. Okay, thanks so much to Mario Parker, who will be with us through the night. Emily Wilkins is covering the Biden campaign for Bloomberg. We welcome her now. Emily, I understand that the vice president's been traveling a little bit today.
He has. The vice president began his day here in Delaware. He visited the grave of his son, Beau Biden, who passed away in 2015. Biden has said that his son's passing was part of the reason he decided to launch this third bid for president. He's been in Scranton, Pennsylvania, visited his childhood home, met with supporters, and has now just landed in Philadelphia. We are expecting him on this stage this evening in Wilmington, Delaware. We don't know whether we'll be able to have a presidential announcement at that point in time, but we are expecting Biden to address the nation.
Okay, thank you so much. And once again, Emily Wilkins will be with us throughout the evening as well as she covers the vice president's campaign. The markets have been watching the election closely in these closing days, and we turn now to Abigail Doolittle for what they're telling us today. So here it is, Abigail. What are they saying?
Well, David, we certainly have investors interested in stocks. We have a very big rally on our hands. The S&P 500 up about 2%. It's best day since June. So investors, again, wanting in on stocks. Interesting, David, is the fact that the VIX, or the volatility index, it is down. That perhaps suggests that some investors think we will know who the next president of the United States is sooner rather than later. And also supporting the risk on tone, we have Haven bonds down. So overall, investors have a pretty strong risk appetite. Now, suggesting or supporting the idea that there could be a blue wave in place, some experts are saying that this move into cyclical sectors that we have seen over the last 5 days, into the materials and the industrial sectors, out of the technology and the discretionary sectors, which are growthier, that supports former Vice President Joe Biden, that his policies support those more cyclical and value areas. On the other hand, David, as you and I have been talking over the last couple of months, the S&P 500 is trading in this huge range over the last 3 months. Historically, when that range is higher, it supports the incumbent re-winning. The bottom line here, David, is that the markets suggest that this presidential race is much narrower than the polls do. Today, the appetite, though, again, the mood, very much risk on.
Okay, thanks so much, Abigail. There'll be a lot more to talk about with the markets and the election as we go forward with Abigail Doolittle. Sabato's crystal ball is one of the key things that we follow to get a sense of the various races around the country. And we welcome now the man himself, Larry Sabato, director of the University of Virginia's Center for Politics. So, Larry, thanks so much for being with us. We've seen your last note, your final note before the election. It has some interesting things in there. Give us your sense of what the key issues are in the presidential for the moment.
Well, in the presidential, the COVID is hanging over everything. And clearly it's changed everything for President Trump. You know, go back to the beginning of the year before we really knew a pandemic was coming, or at least only a handful knew. President Trump had probably a 50-50 or better chance of winning a second term because the economy seemed golden. And most presidents who have a good economy are favored for a second term. Well, we all know what's happened since, and it isn't just the coming of the pandemic. I don't think voters would automatically hold a president responsible for that. But they do hold a president responsible correctly for the administration's response or lack of one to the pandemic. And the judgment's been pretty harsh on President Trump.
Larry, as you know so well, President Trump actually lost the popular vote 4 years ago. But if you look at the Electoral College total, it wasn't actually that close in the end. How many states is the former Vice President Biden going to have to switch to get the 270 magic number?
Well, it depends on whether they're big states or small states. If he switches Florida and Texas, game over. Assuming he holds Hillary Clinton states, which I think he will. If he can't, if he takes Florida, that alone may be enough to close the election down. Although there are a couple of paths, kind of strained, that would get Trump to 270 without Florida. If Texas goes, the game really is over. But Texas would probably only go to Biden if some other states in the Southeast were going to Biden as well, Florida, Georgia, and or North Carolina.
But Sabato's crystal ball, as I understand it, is saying right now, at least, Florida is leaning, not definitely, but leaning Republican, as is Texas. On the other hand, Georgia, I believe you think, is leaning to the Democrats. And I went back and looked. The last time that they voted for a Democrat for president was 1992. It was William Jefferson Clinton the first time around.
That is absolutely correct, but there have been a lot of demographic changes in Georgia, and those demographic changes have switched other states and other parts of the country, Colorado, Virginia being two obvious examples. So you have to keep a close watch on how the population is changing. Now, is Georgia guaranteed to go for Biden? No, it's kind of a coin flip. The same with Florida. The reason we gave Florida still to Trump, because it's absolutely tied in the polling averages. Biden's actually up a little in Florida. But we went with Trump because lately, the last few elections, Republicans have outperformed their polls and they've out-organized the Democrats. And we haven't seen that a whole lot has changed. Now, Georgia's a little different case. North Carolina's a different case. So every state, because of the Electoral College, is its own universe.
At the same time, if you pay attention to what the candidates have done this last 48 hours, 72 hours, you conclude pretty quickly that Pennsylvania is pretty key here. And in your note, I noticed you felt that, I think you termed it as the shakiest about Pennsylvania. What's going on in that state?
It's competitive. It does not appear to be doing what Pennsylvania did last time, because remember, Hillary Clinton lost last time, not as much because the rural turnout was so high or the percentage for Trump was so high, though it was. It's because the urban turnout in Philadelphia and elsewhere in Pennsylvania was limited. It was much lower than expected. There just wasn't that much enthusiasm for Clinton. And of course, some basic constituency groups in the Democratic Party weren't that crazy about her.
Larry, this is an unprecedented election in so many ways. We have a pandemic, as you say. COVID-19 makes it different. The number of early voters now is over 100 million Americans have voted early. Does that make you doubt a bit more how reliable the polls really are? Could this be really a sport case?
Well, after 2016, I wouldn't say I have an excess of confidence in the polls, early vote or no early vote. And I think most people feel the same way there. I think actually the polling has improved a lot. A lot of changes have been made because just about everybody was embarrassed, not by the national polling average, but by specific swing states that clearly didn't go according to polling plan. Well, things have improved. Doesn't mean they're perfect. Doesn't mean they can't be fooled again. But we've looked much more broadly than polling. We've looked at analytics and demographics and also the judgment of people who've been on the ground in those states' politics and swing states for 20, 30, 40 years. Sometimes their judgment's better than the polling.
As you know so well, the Senate is up, perhaps for grabs. It's 3 seats they need if Vice President Biden becomes president. It's 4 if President Trump remains in the Oval Office to switch over the Democrats. What are the key races there?
Well, I tell you that, but if Trump wins re-election, I doubt seriously the Democrats will take over the Senate. So kind of the assumption is that Biden would have to win, and therefore the Democrats need 3 net changes. Remember, the Democrats are losing and will lose, I would presume, Alabama. So that's where they need 4. They have to overcome losing Alabama. I think they've got Arizona. That's a switch. I think the Democrats have Colorado as well. I think they probably will have Maine once the votes are allocated for other candidates. They have ranked choice voting now. This is a new experiment up in Maine, but it's probably going to help the Democratic nominee up in Maine. So that's 3. Where does the 4th one come from? Could be North Carolina, despite a sex scandal on the Democrats. We've gone past scandals, David. You remember a time, as I do, when you had a scandal, you were out.
Yep.
Not anymore.
That's for sure. And in Georgia, the Democrats have not one but two shots.
They have two shots, except they may not get them until January. I think Democrats will lead one of the races. They may lead both of the races, but in Georgia, I think very unwisely, they require 50% plus one, a clear majority, in order to win the seat outright on Election Day. Well, this means a lot of their races go ridiculously long. Imagine having negative ads during the Christmas season. Well, that's what they're going to have with two Senate seats up in early January.
And Larry, finally, let's go home to my home state. I have a prejudice there for Michigan. It's a more interesting Senate race than I think some people thought it was going to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's competitive. If Trump were to pull an upset in Michigan the way he did 4 years ago, then I would almost expect John James, the Republican nominee, who's also African American, to win the seat. Running against a freshman Democrat, Gary Peters, who doesn't have, let's just say, doesn't have the profile that most senators have, relative unknown, even though he's the incumbent. But as long as Biden wins it, I think Biden's probably going to pull Peters across the finish line.
It does strike me that this is yet another election for vets. I mean, we have it in Arizona, we have it in Kentucky, we have it in Michigan. There are a lot of very distinguished former officers in the Corps.
Yes, and we could do a lot worse. That's probably a good thing. You know, in Arizona, of course, this is actually for the McCain seat. There's been a seat warmer who's running for the seat as the Republican nominee, but this is John McCain's seat. So it kind of makes sense. Both of them are military. Both the Republican and Democrat have served in the military.
Certain justice there. But yeah, both aviators as well. It's very fascinating. Thank you so much to Larry Sabato. Always great to have you with us, Larry. That's director of the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia. Coming up, the polls have had their say. The candidates have pretty much had theirs as well. Now it's up to the voters and those counting the votes. We turn to our Bloomberg political contributor, Jeannie Zaino. Next, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. As we go out for our television audience, we're looking at voters in San Francisco in line. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We're going to turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, we are here. Americans continue to turn out in huge numbers to cast their ballots on this election day. The Elections Project says more than 100 million Americans have already voted. And by the time polls close tonight, the Department of Homeland Security estimates that number will be 150 million. Americans may not know who will be sworn in as president next January for days or weeks. If a tight race in battleground states prompts special challenges over late arriving ballots. They may have tried, but no foreign hackers successfully meddled in the 2020 elections here in the United States. That today from Acting Homeland Security Secretary Chad Wolf. He says officials remain on high alert for any interference by foreign actors, including Russia, China, and Iran. President Trump has repeatedly challenged the U.S. intelligence community's finding that Russia tried to influence the 2016 election in his favor. Retailers are bracing for potential violence in the wake of the election. Store owners here in Manhattan, in Washington, and in other cities have boarded up their windows. In Beverly Hills, police are closing the famed Rodeo Drive today and tomorrow. In the UK, officials are preparing to raise the country's terror threat level to severe, the second highest level. That follows terror attacks in Nice, France, and Vienna, Austria. A level of severe means officials believe an attack is, quote, highly likely. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Well, as Mark said, nearly 100 million Americans have already voted in this year's election, and now many of those who didn't vote earlier are showing up at polling places all around the country. What does voter turnout really tell us about this election? We turn now to our political contributor, Jeannie Zaino, because she is professor of political science at Iona College. So, Professor, you understand these things. What's happening if, in fact, we have a record turnout, which looks entirely possible, doesn't it?
It does look possible. As Mark said, if we're at 100 million now, we would only need about 40 million to match where we were in 2016. And I'm looking at turnout numbers, and we remember like 1996, we were under 100 million in terms of turnout, and in 2000, just over that. So this is really, if we do get there, and that's still a big if, this is really a big turnout for the United States. We'd be in the upper 50%, maybe lower 60% of voting age population. And I think it speaks to the amount of interest. I think it speaks to enthusiasm. I also think it speaks to the big issues on the table, mainly, as you were just talking to Larry Sabato about COVID, issues of health care, but also obviously the economy, and, of course, social unrest and racial tension, all of the things we've been battling, the future of the court over the last year.
So Jeannie, speculate with me a bit. We're not supposed to do that, but let's do it for a moment. The whole complexion of the country is changing. The age is changing. The race, the ethnicity of the country is changing. If overall there's a dramatic increase in participation, could that change the composition of the people who are voting?
It absolutely could. And I think one of the big things I'm curious about tonight is what happens in the southern, what is traditionally, at least for the last several decades, been reliably Republican wall in the South. Do we see, I think we've already begun to see the beginnings of that due to demographic changes, but do we see an actual break in Texas where some Democrats say there is a small chance that Biden could take that? Certainly Georgia, we saw the beginnings of that with Stacey Abrams, who I think deserves a lot of credit for Democrats in terms of starting to move things there. So if we see a shift in the South from red to blue or red to pinkish, moving to blue, I think we know that's all a result of demographic changes and really suggests that we're in the midst of a real realignment period in the United States.
Well, exactly. And it's way too early to declare that, but we should be looking for it to see whether that happens or it doesn't happen, because as you know so well, there was a realignment where the South was always Democrat after the Civil War for the better part of 100 years, and then it switched to Republican. It was solid Republican. If it starts to switch back again, that could be a profound change in our country for some years to come.
Absolutely. And I was just looking back. I mean, you look back after 2008 when Republicans lost the White House, they wrote a big report that we've all read, and they talked about how they had to reach out particularly to Hispanics, Latinos, African Americans. Changing demographics were going to really make it hard for the party to continue to win if they didn't start reaching out. And they started to do that. And of course, in this last election, they pulled back. But I think we're starting to see the argument they were making. Demographics have shifted here, and they have to move if they are going to maintain as a viable, energized umbrella party in the United States. They're going to have to reach out as well.
Because that's the South, which may well be critical in this election. At the same time, let's not leave behind my old stomping ground of the upper Midwest, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. They may well be a turning point as well, particularly Pennsylvania, which seems to be the jump ball right now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why we've seen the campaign spend so much time there. Obviously, the home of the Constitution. And if things go President Trump's way, I think early in the night, if he can hold the Sun Belt, it may all come down to Pennsylvania. And as we know, then the next question is going to be, when are we going to get results out of there? It could be several days. And Mark just mentioned this. We could be looking at least a few days, if not longer, before we get results. And then, of course, we could see litigation over those results. So if the president is able to hold his 2016 numbers and he doesn't even flip anything from 16 that was blue to red, then we are looking at probably Pennsylvania, because it's unlikely at this point he takes your home state of Michigan or Wisconsin, if you believe the polls.
So, Jeannie, we'll be talking about this throughout the evening as Rick Davis and you and I all talk about this together. But it emphasizes the importance of patience, because of all those absentee ballots yet to be counted, you may not just have a delay in the results, but the results might start out one direction and go another direction as more votes are counted.
Absolutely. So, I think we all have to be cognizant of what they're calling this red or this blue mirage, right? We know that Democrats have benefited at least a bit from early voting, but we suspect Republicans will benefit from same-day voting. And so depending on what votes a state is counting at what time, you may see movement towards Biden, which then will be offset by people who voted today voting for Trump, and vice versa. So we do have to be patient, particularly in these battleground states. that could decide the race, and we suspect are going to be pretty close. I mean, we just talked yesterday about this poll out of Iowa, which suggests the president is 7 points ahead. There was one last night out of Georgia saying the president is about 4 points. Now, those just one poll each, both good polls, but these are tight races all around, certainly within a margin of error in some of these battleground states.
So a lot of suspense tonight, I suspect. Thank you so much. Great to talk to you as always. That's Bloomberg political contributor Jeannie Zaino. And as I say, she's going to be with us throughout our election coverage night. We're going to start at 7 p.m. Eastern time tonight. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Markets have been doing their very best to figure out this election, and one place we're seeing some interesting moves are the currency markets. Let's check in now with Scarlett Fu to get a sense of where FX traders are headed. Scarlett?
Yeah, it's risk on across all the asset classes, so the flight to safety trades are really unwinding right now, and you're seeing that in the U.S. dollar. Falling the most since late August. It's weaker versus all the G10 currencies and down versus almost all the major currencies as well, performing the worst against the commodity currencies like the Norwegian krone, Aussie dollar, and South African rand. This, of course, as crude oil rallies. What you'll also notice is the relationship between the dollar and stocks. They've largely maintained their inverse relationship. So when stocks rise, the S&P 500 increases, the U.S. dollar has been faltering. And the white line is the inverse of the U.S. Bloomberg Dollar Index. So you can see that relationship there. Zach Pandel over at Goldman Sachs, who heads up the FX and EM strategy team, was on Bloomberg Television earlier, and he walked us through what the FX trading desks will focus on this evening as the votes are counted. Initially, it'll be what happens with the White House. And for that, investors will really fixate on the Chinese yuan because U.S. foreign policy is the domain of the president, not so much Congress. And the Chinese yuan has benefited from the increased odds of a Biden presidency. The thinking is that a Biden presidency would want to return to multilateral trading systems, and that means the WTO matters, and perhaps he'll roll back the Chinese tariffs. As the night continues, the focus will then turn to the Senate. And if the Democrats prevail and they win control, how does that shake out for fiscal stimulus? You'll likely see gains in risk currencies, and here we're talking about emerging market currencies and bond yields on the idea that more spending will lead to a bigger budget deficit and will accelerate inflation. And just one last note here, David, I want to leave you on this idea that the long ruble short peso trade that proved so popular after President Trump's election in 2016 unwinding very quickly right now.
Thank you, my favorite trade. Thanks so much to Bloomberg's Scarlett Fu. Coming up next, Leon Panetta, former Secretary of Defense, on election security on this election day. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. President Trump is pledging a legal fight over vote counting that drags on after polls close, all but guaranteeing an ongoing struggle if the election result is close. The legal battle could center on the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. That's a crucial swing state. Republicans have filed a lawsuit in a suburban county near Philadelphia, alleging officials there illegally allowed absentee and mail-in ballots to be counted before Election Day. Battles are also unfolding in several other key states, including Wisconsin. Over the weekend, Mr. Trump said that as soon as the election is over, quote, "we're going in with our lawyers," end quote. Democrat Joe Biden returned to his childhood home of Scranton, Pennsylvania, where he visited his home and made another appeal to working-class voters. Mr. Biden said he wants to restore, quote, "basic decency and honor," and unite the country he said has fractured under the Trump administration. German officials are cautiously optimistic that the coronavirus pandemic is beginning to ease. Health officials say the curve appears to be flattening somewhat, but that it's too early to conclude that there has been a turning point. Germany reported more than 15,000 new cases today, down slightly from record highs in the past week. In China, President Xi Jinping says the economy can double in size by 2035. President Xi also told the Communist Party's Central Committee that the country can reach high-income status in the next 5 years. Last week, the party released a broad framework of its new 5-year plan. It focuses on self-reliance in technology, boosting domestic consumption, and pursuing quality growth. And turning to the UK, famous fund manager Crispin Odey is stepping down from running his firm. That news came out in the last few minutes. He will focus on funds instead. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you very much, Mark. We may never have had an election with this much anxiety about the process itself, with lawsuits filed and questions raised even by the incumbent president himself. Welcome now one of the most experienced government officials ever to have served. Leon Panetta was a congressman from his home state of California, chief of staff to President Clinton, and CIA director and secretary of defense under President Obama. He is now chairman of the Panetta Institute for Public Policy at Cal State Monterey Bay. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. Can't think of anybody I'd rather talk to on a day like today. But I want to start with a piece that you wrote with another former Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, in The Hill, talking about election security, which we're very mindful of today. And just one brief quote from it: voters across the political spectrum must have faith in our democratic system and trust that the winner won the election without voter fraud or foul play. I dare say that you would have said that any time in the past, but would you have had to write this piece? What is it special about this election that we're that concerned about that question?
Well, it's obvious that a lot of concerns have been raised about the election and whether it would be free and fair, and whether there would be enough patience for all the votes to be counted, and whether or not it would remain peaceful. Those are real issues, and as you can hear, the president already is deploying lawyers, and others are deploying lawyers. So there's a lot of concern about ultimately whether or not this country can conduct a free and fair election and be able to determine a winner in the presidential race. I'm confident that we can. I really am. I think our state officials know their job. They've done this before, and I have great confidence in their ability to be able to vote, to count votes, and to do it accurately.
We do have a remarkable situation right now with over 100 million Americans now already have voted early, either in person or by absentee ballot. As a practical matter, does that raise the risk at all of the security of the election?
Well, I think all of us ought to be very proud of a country where 150 million people go to the polls to cast their vote. That goes to the very heart of what our democracy is all about. Can we handle that volume? I think we can, mainly because these state officials have committed themselves to making sure that every vote counts, and I think they will in this case. I think probably the most important thing that's going to be required is patience. Patience to allow the state officials to conduct these counts, patience to get an accurate vote count that can determine who the winner is, and patience to allow our system of voting to be able to work and work effectively. I think it can, but boy, are we going to have to be patient as these votes are counted.
Yeah, and part of whom you're talking to is the media, I suspect, because the media is usually in a rush to try to get an answer out. 4 years ago, there was a lot of concern about foreign interference in our election, particularly by the Russians, and lots of investigations, things like that. We don't necessarily hear as much about that today. Have we basically addressed that problem, do you think? Is it as big a problem today as it was 4 years ago?
Well, there's no question we're doing more to defend against the actions of the Russians to try to interfere in our election process. We've learned a lot about how they operate, and we learned a lot about how to try to check them. I think the most important thing is I do not believe, and intelligence officials have confirmed this, that there's any indication that they've made their way into our election structure. It was probably the greatest area of concern with regards to foreign interference. So they're going to continue to use social media. They'll continue to try to deploy various comments that will try to undermine trust in the election result. But I think the American people and our election officials have learned how to cope with that. And I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to get through this election and be able to determine a winner and where our democracy is headed in the future.
Mr. Secretary, as I say, I can't think of many officials, former officials, who've had the kind of experience you've had, both in the legislative branch and the executive branch. Take us forward after November 3rd. Whether it's November 3rd or a few days after, there will be a decision one way or the other. We'll either have a President Biden or we'll have a President Trump. What happens at the White House? I mean, what happens with the transition, either for the incumbent, because they have to prepare for the second 4 years, or for a new president?
Well, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in either case. If it's an incumbent president, obviously you have a team in place, and you would assume that you've begun planning for what are the goals that you're going to try to achieve in a second term. And I've been there, worked with President Clinton at the time, and we basically laid out a whole agenda for the second term that had to be implemented. And I would hope that this president would do the same. For a new president, it's a bigger challenge, because you've got to put together a team. You've got to put together your White House team. You've got to begin to assemble your cabinet. And at the same time, you've got to begin to prepare the policy initiatives that you're going to initiate as soon as you're inaugurated president of the United States. It's a much bigger challenge, but it's one we've been through in the past, and I'm sure we can go through again in the present.
For our radio audience, to explain what's going on for the TV audience, we've been showing some pictures with the Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, of Milwaukee, where people are lined up voting. So when you see that on television, that's what that is. That is Milwaukee you're looking at. For the radio audiences, there's a line there outside in the sunshine, I must say. So Secretary Panetta, let's assume for the moment, and it's just assuming, that it is a President Biden. What is number one on his agenda, or what would you recommend he put as number one on his agenda to accomplish in his term?
Well, if it's a President Biden, it will be for one reason and one reason only, which is the situation with COVID-19 and the failure to deal with this terrible pandemic. And I don't think there's any question that his first initiative, his first objective, has got to be to show that he's getting control of the pandemic, and probably providing the necessary aid to try to help those who have been impacted. It's too bad that the Congress was unable to pass an aid package. I think we need something to provide assistance to those that are unemployed, those small businesses and others that have been affected by this. So I think his first objective is get control of the pandemic and provide an aid package to the country.
You were director of CIA as well as Secretary of Defense. Give us a sense about how important our relations are with the rest of the world when there is a transition in the presidency. That can be a time of some stress. For example, let's talk about Asia. There are a lot of markets right now we've been reporting on that apparently think that Vice President Biden as President Biden would be easier on China, would be better for China. Is that accurate?
Well, not necessarily. I think Joe Biden has said that we have a competitive relationship with China, and we do. And it's one that will demand a lot of toughness on our part in dealing with them. But the one thing you can be assured of, and I think this is comforting to a lot of countries abroad, is that Joe Biden is going to return this country to an international approach that has the United States being a world leader. We're not going to withdraw from leadership in the world. We're not going to walk away from our alliances. We're going to build alliances, and we're going to stress United States leadership in the world. Those are things that I think the rest of the world is anxious to get.
And finally, Secretary Panetta, how quickly can a government turn? As a practical matter, it's not just the president, not just the few dozen or even hundreds that he brings in with him. There's a huge apparatus there. Does a government turn quickly?
No, not really. It's going to take a while to get your team in place, to be able to move the policies that you want to move. Every president is frustrated by that, but it is a reality. It takes time. A lot depends on the Congress, willingness of the Congress to be able to work with the president. I think the one thing about Joe Biden is he is a legislator and somebody who's willing to work with both Republicans and Democrats. That's a good sign. But it's going to take time. We're facing an awful lot of crises in this country between the pandemic, a recession, the other problems that we're confronting as a society. And so it's going to take time to be able to direct this country in a way that allows us to take on these crises and try to get ahead of it rather than behind them.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary, for being with us. Always a treat to talk to you. That's Leon Panetta. He's the former White House Chief of Staff and former Secretary of Defense. Coming up here, a view of the election from the Republican side of the aisle with Sarah Chamberlain. She's president and CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. President Trump touts his 4 years of leadership, what it's done for the American economy, for American business, and for American workers. We welcome now someone who leads an organization committed to, quote, conservative, pragmatic government. Sarah Chamberlain is president and CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership. So, Sarah, thank you so much for being back with us. Really enjoy your company. 4 years ago, President Donald Trump won. He actually lost the popular election, but won the Electoral College by a good margin. As you look at the election this time, how is it different from 4 years ago?
Well, David, first of all, thank you so much. Thrilled to be back here with you. But the number one thing I'm finding, and my phone has been blowing up today, 4 years ago, people were interested. They kind of enjoyed the process. Today, they just want it to be over. They want the chaos to end. They want whomever wins to win and then just move on with their lives. I mean, they just can't stand all of this, the conflict. You know, they have enough of it with COVID, frankly, with their kids at home. Actually, my daughter's upstairs going to school. And they just want this to end. And I've never seen it like that before in an election cycle.
So, Sarah, you must find a fair amount of irony in what you just said. In this sense, the two numbers that have struck me is the president has around about a 45% job approval rating, but 61% of the people told Gallup that they think they're better off than they were 4 years ago. It's hard to square those two.
It's almost impossible to square them, but how I try to do it is people like his policies, and they are better off. You know, the tax cuts, all the things that he did prior to COVID-19, but they don't really care for the man. You know, I travel the country, or I did before COVID, now I do it online, talking to suburban people, mainly women, but, you know, their husbands as well, the men that live in the suburbs, and they just are tired of his tweeting.
But if there are suburban women who are frustrated, do they sit home or do they actually vote for Joe Biden?
They are voting like crazy. Most of them have voted by mail. They think that the mail system is going to work just fine, but they are voting. They are not sitting home.
Let's assume that, in fact, President Trump is reelected. And as you say, you really agree with a number of his policies, many of his policies in the first 4 years. What do you think, or what would you hope President Trump would do in his second 4 years?
Okay, well, the first thing is I would ask him to take COVID seriously, ask people to wear masks. I know you can't mandate that legally, but we have to do something around COVID. You know, all the experts say that it's going to get worse around Thanksgiving. We're concerned our kids are going to maybe have a whole year, another whole year at home. And we have to do this. You know, with the chaos going on in the homes, with us trying to work, with our kids going to school, they're not seeing their friends. That is the number one issue that I really wish he would just buckle down, get the country to do the mask, try to figure this out. I know he's working on getting us a vaccination as soon as possible, but that would be the biggest issue. And then people can feel free to go out, spend money, you know, in businesses, go back to work, but we have to have something. And we need a mask. We need to make it cool and okay to wear masks.
So, Sarah, as you talk to these suburban women around the country, and they're frustrated, obviously, with being cooped up, and your point is so powerful with children basically trying to learn from home, and it's not an ideal situation, particularly younger children. It's terribly difficult to do it with. Do they blame the people saying they should stay home, or do they blame the people who haven't figured out how to fix this problem?
It's a combination of both. They blame the people who haven't figured out how to fix the problem, but really what they're telling me is they're blaming the people who aren't wearing masks. Like, you know what? They don't enjoy wearing masks either. I don't either. But, you know, we want to protect each other. We have to start to wear masks. I mean, I've had women tell me their husbands have almost gotten in fights because they're wearing their masks and people around them aren't. They ask them why they aren't, and it almost comes to blows. We have to stop politicizing mask wearing and make it more medical.
What do you put the odds at of trying to bring the country back together, whichever candidate wins this presidency? Because I think we could all agree there are deep divisions, and they're personal divisions, they're extreme divisions. They show up in really unfortunate, even ugly ways.
I think we can come back together. The country's been through a lot prior to all this, the Civil War, all of this. We will come back together because we are the United States of America.
And what do you think about the Senate? Do you have a view on what happens in the United States Senate? They need 3 or 4 seats for it to go to the Democrats.
I would have told you a few weeks ago that I thought the Senate was going to be lost, but I think North Carolina is very interesting. I have family down there, and I think Tillis may be able to hold on to the seat, which could be the one seat that's the difference with maintaining control of the Senate. The Democrat, unforced error, stupid unforced error, frankly.
Fascinating. Okay, thank you so much. It's always a treat to talk to you. That is the president and CEO of Republican Main Street Partnership. She is Sarah Chamberlain. Coming up, we're going to take an early look at the critical state of Pennsylvania with our reporter there, Mark Niquette. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Pennsylvania may well end up being key to this election. Both President Trump and Vice President Biden have spent much of the stretch in the Keystone State. Joe Biden finished the campaign last night where he started in Pittsburgh, while his running mate, Senator Kamala Harris, headlined a rally in Philadelphia. Bloomberg's Mark Niquette joins us from the city of brotherly love outside the Philadelphia Convention Center. This is where they started counting mail-in and absentee ballots at 7 a.m. this morning. So, Mark, welcome. Actually, as I understand it, the former vice president showed up in Philadelphia today, didn't he?
Yes, he was in Philadelphia and also Scranton, where he spent part of his childhood.
Okay, so give us a sense of Pennsylvania, because everybody agrees it's key, and yet everyone seems to have a tough time getting their arms around what's going on in the state. You get very different accounts.
Yeah, Pennsylvania, it could come down to Pennsylvania in the presidential race. 538 does this analysis where they calculate which state has the highest chance of being the tipping point state that a candidate needs to get to 270 electoral votes, and 538 ranks Pennsylvania highest by far among all other states. And it's also a state that just started this year with mail-in balloting. Before you had to have an excuse for absentee balloting. This year they don't, and they're implementing this new system with new voting machines during a pandemic. So we have the uncertainty of what impact the mail-in ballots are going to have, and an additional complication that we're not going to get final results probably out of Pennsylvania tonight. Because of all these new mail-in ballots coming in, Pennsylvania's law doesn't allow clerks to start counting these ballots until 7 a.m. on Election Day today. So it's guaranteed there's going to be uncounted ballots after the election to fight over, and could be needed to determine who actually won this race. So it could be a long couple of days here in Pennsylvania to get the outcome of the presidential race that might be needed to determine who won the race nationally.
And just to add to the complication, not that we need more complication, is there was this dispute about whether ballots that were postmarked by November 3rd would be counted after. As I understand, the courts, as of right now, said you can count them for 3 days if they come in within 3 days after the date, although they're segregating the ballots, right? So there could be a fight down the road about whether those ballots get counted or not.
Right, that's another pool of outstanding uncounted ballots that could be the source of litigation. In fact, it already is. You're right. The state Supreme Court here ruled that those ballots could be accepted within 3 days after the election if they were mailed before. Current law had said they had to be in by the time the polls closed at 8 p.m. Republicans sued to block that extension, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled not to stay the extension, but sort of left the door open that the extension could be challenged on its merits. So it's sort of hanging out there as a possibility that we could see the Supreme Court taking up, whether these ballots that are cast, that are mailed before the election, that arrive afterwards, can be counted. We don't know at this point how many of those ballots there will be, but you're right. The Secretary of the Commonwealth here has ordered those ballots to be segregated and counted separately. So at least we'll have an idea of how many votes are there,
Right.
and if it does matter, if the margin's small enough that these ballots could be determinative.
Mark, do we have any sense yet of how many absentee ballots or mail-in ballots have already been received? I mean, for example, we know in Texas that as of a couple of days ago, they'd received more than they had total votes last time.
Yeah, here in Pennsylvania, they've received, as of this morning, more than 2.5 million, which is smaller than Texas, but for Pennsylvania, it's enormous. In the 2016 election, Pennsylvania, under its old system of voting where you needed an excuse to vote an absentee ballot, only had like 266,000, so 10 times that number are voting, and it's just overwhelmed the system. Pennsylvania law hasn't sort of caught up, the election law, to accommodate that number of outstanding ballots. Like I said, you have this provision where you can't start counting these ballots until Election Day. Most states give multiple days before the election to start processing, so you're not in this situation of not being able to have complete results on election night. And there was a big fight here in the Commonwealth before the election where the Republicans and Democrats just couldn't agree on a deal that would allow that more time.
Well, it's very complicated, as you say, so I'm glad you're there to report on it throughout this process, however long it may take. That's Bloomberg's Mark Niquette reporting from Philadelphia. Mark, as I say, will be part of our full election coverage. That's going to be starting tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Coming up, our second hour of Balance of Power on both radio and television for this election day. Next hour, we talk to Liz Ann Sonders and also Florida Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to the second hour of Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On this election day, we start off with our Washington reporter, Laura Davison, to bring us up to speed on the Senate races we should be watching as polls are open across most of the nation. So we're all fixated on the presidency, but there's a little thing called the Senate that may hang in the balance as well, Laura.
Yes, and in terms of what it would mean going forward, the Senate is no small thing. There are 14 races that are really hotly contested here. Democrats have an edge in about 12 of them, so that's good news for Joe Biden. If he were to win, that he would have a chance of having a Democratic Senate in his place. Because if Mitch McConnell keeps the Senate, if Republicans are there, really all of Biden's policy plans aren't going anywhere. He is totally stuck. But if he has the Senate, that's when we'll start seeing things like the tax increases, his new spending plans, infrastructure, healthcare spending. That's really the key that he needs here. So there's lots of interesting states, all the same states we're talking about in terms of the presidential election for the most part, Georgia being one of the most interesting because there are 2 open seats there. And that would be a big shift if Georgia were to have 1 or potentially 2 Democratic senators from that state.
So your job is not to analyze or project, but it is to report. And what can you report from the Democrat side? Which are the ones they hope to take? Because they need essentially 3, right? Because as a practical matter, they're probably not going to be able to take the Senate if they don't have Joe Biden win the presidency.
Yes, yeah, they'll could need even as many as 4 because Doug Jones in Alabama is likely to lose there. The polls do not look great for him. But, looking at some of these races in Georgia, looking at North Carolina, looking at Arizona, and also Maine, Susan Collins, who had been a longstanding senator there, she, the polls have not been very optimistic on her outlook. So there's a couple easy ones with some Democrats have found some good candidates they think will do well against some Republicans that are largely unpopular in their state. Susan Collins of Maine, Martha McSally of Arizona, as well as also in North Carolina. There's an interesting race there. That's been one of those states that's been sort of purple for a while, and Democrats haven't yet been able to eke out an edge there. So Tom Tillis has been very close with his opponent Cunningham, though Cunningham has had some personal issues, an affair that was leaked. So there's lots of drama there in really tight races. Democrats have consistently out-fundraised Republicans, but the polls have been a lot closer.
Okay, thank you so much, Laura. Always great to have you with us. That is Bloomberg's Laura Davison reporting from Washington. Rick Davis has seen his own fair share of political campaigns, including as the manager for John McCain's run for the presidency. He's now a partner at Stone Court Capital, and I'm pleased to say a political contributor to Bloomberg. So, Rick, give us your sense, your game day analysis of where we are.
Well, with 100 million people already voted, this is going to turn out, I think, to be one of the great historic turnout elections of the century. it's been 100 years since we crossed anywhere near the 65 to 70% turnout mark, and I think that it's built into the cards today to be able to try and get there with this massive early vote. And so what goes along with that early vote is, how did the pandemic affect this election? Obviously, we've seen how it affected the campaigning for it, with Joe Biden doing social distancing campaigning and Donald Trump coming down with COVID himself. So it's had an impact there. But how will it impact the voters? And the voters are going to give us a signal to that direction by close of business today.
So give us a sense, as a practical matter, if we get a reasonably early answer, which I'm going to say by midnight, 1 o'clock, something like that, is that most likely to be bad news for the president? That is to say, if it really is going to be decided, does it go one way?
Well, early decisions are bad for the president. In other words, if the president is losing states like North Carolina and Florida, we've talked a little bit about Pennsylvania. It's kind of hard to tell whether we're going to know that anytime early, but it'll report early. There may be some surprises like in Iowa. Before we get really to the center of the country, if there are upsets, in other words, Donald Trump starts losing states he won in 2016, it could be a harbinger for what happens next. And I would say by the time we get to the West, if Arizona flips and becomes a state that votes for the Democrat for the first time since 92, that would be a death knell for Donald Trump.
Yeah, just to explain, our TV audience right now is watching President Trump, live shot of President Trump. I believe he's at the RNC headquarters over across the river in Arlington, giving a few remarks. This was his his only trip today. We had, on the other hand, Vice President Biden going to Scranton and to Philadelphia, but President Trump's giving some remarks to his troops, as it were, over in Arlington. So, Rick, what are you looking at for the most part right now?
Right now, there isn't much to look at. I mean, while people vote, you don't get real-time information from the counties on what's reporting. So I have probably 20 counties around the country in these battleground states that I want to see what kind of votes coming out of there. I spent a lot of time today looking over the early vote totals and what the demographics are around them. And I do think it is showing one thing to me today that could be interesting advantage for Joe Biden in some places, and that is that there are people voting in this presidential election as part of this early vote who have not been to the polls in 8 years. And so these are brand new, fresh voters. They're not swing voters. They're just new voters. And new voters tend to be younger voters. In other words, people who don't participate very often. They make up some of this 100 million that has already voted. And voters of color, Hispanics, Asians, African Americans. And those two demographic groups would tend to vote Democratic, tend to vote for Joe Biden. So if they have a significant presence in some of these key counties in the battleground states, they could make some of these states turn blue that otherwise might be red.
So, Rick, it's way early going, and you and I are going to say this all the way through the night. We got to be patient, can't draw too many conclusions. But pick up on that for a moment. When you have perhaps record turnout, and yet a country, and particularly certain states that are changing demographically. That Arizona, a state you know terribly well. You've run a lot of campaigns there. You know Arizona. Very changing demographically. Georgia's changing. North Carolina's changing. As a practical matter, as you add more young people and more people of color in, is that a challenge for the Republican Party, perhaps more than for the Democratic Party?
Well, I think even more so a challenge for the Donald Trump Republican Party. I mean, we've all been through eras where, like, Ronald Reagan had the big tent theory of the Republican Party, welcomed anybody in who, would support his philosophies. And yet Donald Trump's approach has been wildly different, right? He's lambasted urban areas. He's taken shots in the cultural insensitivity category, and the party itself has really focused their recruitment efforts in rural white America, not in these groups that you were just talking about. And so, sure, maybe they're going to boost up the rural white vote in these key states that helped Donald Trump win in 2016, but they're not being competitive because they're not allowing themselves to recruit Hispanics and people of color in states like what you just talked about, where the population is changing.
What about the Latino vote, though? I mean, your old boss and dear friend, I know, John McCain, really was out front on this in terms of the Republicans appealing to the Latino vote. Could there be a surprise afoot here? Because we hear reports, for example, from the Latino community saying, you know what, we really care about jobs and opportunity, and we think Trump may not be bad at that. And also there's the socialist accusation coming out of perhaps the Cuban Hispanic population down in South Miami.
Yeah, well, the Hispanic population, like many of these, are not homogeneous, right? I mean, like when you just described the Cubans in South Florida, they don't vote the same way Puerto Ricans in New York do, and Puerto Ricans in New York don't vote the same way Mexican Americans in Arizona and New Mexico and California do. So it's kind of hard to lump them all into one category. That being said, John McCain always felt that the Republican Party was the right place for Hispanic voters because they are socially conservative. They're vastly majority Catholic and pro-life. They are business owners by a large percentage, which gives them some sensitivity to economic issues that otherwise they wouldn't. And so that's part of the motivation he's always had to try and solve these issues in Republican administrations around immigration reform. That being said, it didn't happen. And so it's been an easy place for Democrats to recruit both candidates and voters. It'll be interesting to see whether or not Trump can fashion together anti-Castro Cubans in Florida, anti-Maduro Venezuelans in the same state, to be able to show that he can find his own way through the Hispanic vote.
Rick, thank you so very much. I'm really looking forward to spending the evening with you. That's our Bloomberg political contributor, Rick Davis, who will be joining me again tonight for our special coverage kicking off at 7 p.m. Eastern Time in New York. Coming up here, helping investors get a read on what this election could mean for business and the economy. We're joined by Charles Schwab Chief Investment Strategist Liz Ann Saunders. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Equity and debt markets have been trying to position themselves for what comes after the election today. Here to give us a sense of where they are at the moment is Abigail Doolittle.
David, we're looking at a very much risk-on tone on election days. The bulls are truly rushing in as far as stocks. We have the S&P 500 up about 2%. Its best day since June. The NASDAQ 100 is higher. And in fact, the best 2 days since early June. So after 2 down weeks, we have 2 big up days. This is actually pretty similar to 2016, which is interesting in a way. Now, also interesting, the VIX, that volatility index, it's down a little bit today. Some might think that this suggests that we could know who the next president of the United States is sooner rather than later. That VIX curve has been rising on the uncertainty, but today it is subdued. We also have the dollar down, its worst day since the end of August, and suggesting, David, perhaps that there's a blue wave positioned here in the markets. If we take a look at the yield curve, the 230 yield curve, we are going to see that it is steepening. In fact, it's been playing with levels that it was at since the end of 2018. The idea here is it suggests that rising inflation could come if more stimulus happens. So if there is a blue wave, stimulus could more easily enter the picture. Also, perhaps supporting the idea that we're seeing a blue wave sector rotation. What we have going on is a move into the cyclical and the value sectors, out of growth and some of the more momentum sectors such as technology and discretionary, which are on the bottom here over the last 5 days. On the other hand, materials and the industrials, those sectors we really have investors going into strongly. However, there's a ton of uncertainty out there. the S&P 500 over the last 3 months really stuck in a range between, let's call it 3,200 and not quite 3,600, but very close. This signals tons of uncertainty on the part of investors, not just around the election. Let's, of course, remember the virus situation. However, historically, David, over the 3 months into the election, if the S&P 500 is higher, that tends to support the incumbent. That is the case here for the S&P 500. I think the biggest message that we have, though, David, lots of mixed messages. The market's suggesting that the election, the race could be much narrower than what the polls are suggesting, David.
Okay, Abigail, that's just what we needed, a narrower election than we thought. That's Abigail Doolittle reporting on the markets. Sooner or later, we're going to know the results of the election going on today, but investors want to be looking beyond the next few days to anticipate where the economy is headed and where investments will do better or do less well in the world we find after November 3rd. No one does that better than Liz Ann Saunders. She's Chief Investment Strategist for Charles Schwab, and we welcome her now back to Bloomberg. So, Liz Ann, thanks so much for being with us. Before we go forward into what's coming up next, explain why we're where we are right now, because equities have sort of been pulling back. We're having a good day today, but they've been sort of pulling back, haven't they?
They have. And I think really what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is not all that different than what we saw in the aftermath of the all-time highs that were reached in early September. And there were a lot of narratives at play as to what caused the pullback during that 3-week period in September, and then the most recent pullback culminating in last week being the worst since March. And a lot of those are the traditional, and I would say catalysts over causes. Maybe it's semantics, but I think it's more important to talk about them as catalysts. Obviously, election uncertainty, obviously uncertainty with regard to the virus and the surge in virus cases. What was uncertainty back in September now is simple knowledge that we're not getting a fiscal relief package. But I think there were catalysts for an environment that had become really speculatively overly optimistic. And I think it was that sentiment environment that triggered the corrective phase in September and then the more recent one. And then what happens in the course of those few days or a few weeks is you get the market into a short-term oversold, and that sets up the possibility of a bounce, even if there's no obvious catalyst for that. So I think the strength in the last couple of days may actually tie more to the weakness that preceded it versus any of these other catalysts. And I would agree, it's kind of a funky day today. It's not really it's a reflation trade because you've got financials and industrials at the top of the leaderboard, but energy and materials at the bottom of the leaderboard. So it's not really a defensive to cyclical because you've got cyclicals on the top end at the bottom end. I just think that there's a lot of rotation happening and churning that's happening, at least until we have a sense of what happened today.
Well, let's talk about that rotation, or at least what may be rotation, because we have what you call the big five, because you point out they're not all tech stocks, although people talk about it as tech stocks. We've got Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Facebook that had been leading the way up, and now they've been leading the way down to some extent.
They have, and that really, if you track on a year-to-date basis, on a rolling daily basis, the spread between the big five and the other 495 within the S&P, tying to the same day, September 2nd, was the point where not only we had the major indices hit all-time highs, but that was the widest spread of outperformance between the big five and the other 495, since which time we now have about 700 basis points of underperformance of the big five. But what you've seen, again, is sort of this rotational churning. The need for the market to correct the speculative excess, the valuation excess associated with that small subset of names, and it's not just those five, but it's certainly a small subset, can actually happen and has been happening in the context of a rotation, not necessarily you correct those excesses and the bottom falls out, which is really what happened back in the 2000 timeframe. And I think that's indicative of this speculative excess that I talk about, not just having been more concentrated in a small subset of names, but really was concentrated really in the cohort of the newly minted day traders and witnessed in names like this and in the options market more so than the speculative excess across the board. And I think that's been the saving grace.
Liz Ann, you mentioned uncertainty about the election. And certainly we have that right now as we all go to the polls today if we haven't already voted. And it strikes me that that could affect two of the three factors that could be really dampening some of the enthusiasm. That is to say, who is the president of the United States, but also new stimulus, because who gets elected president and who's in the Senate could affect that. As an investor, how do you plan for that? Not knowing exactly where it's going to come out, how big a difference is there on those two forks in the road?
I do think think the next fiscal relief package, which is probably a better way to describe it, is coming regardless of the outcome. Now, the details within will differ, of course, depending on the election outcome, and the timing is likely to differ depending on the outlook. But I think it's coming. I think the issue between now and then, and we don't know what the then is what happens to the economy, driven, of course, by the virus. And even absent lockdowns, any kind of formal lockdowns, what we already see in the economic data is that human beings and small businesses still make decisions. And I do believe that we haven't finished building the bridge to get the economy across the chasm created by the virus. And that what's important, in particular, the labor market indicators that we'll get in the next month or two as to how quickly we need that fiscal relief. And I think we're going to hear more about that probably from Powell on Thursday after the Fed meets, within the press conference, a further push, especially if there's an actual election victor, to kind of get on the ball and get some more of this fiscal relief.
Okay, Lizanne, always a treat to have you. That's Lizanne Saunders. She's Chief Investment Strategist at Charles Schwab. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. The time has come to elect the next president of the United States, and the stakes could not be higher. Two candidates, two very different paths for the future of the country. I'm David Weston. We will bring you the results as they unfold live on election night. Join us Tuesday, November 3rd at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Television and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. We're going to turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. There has been speculation that President Trump might declare victory tonight, whether or not he has actually won. But the president tells Fox News there is, quote, no reason to play games about declaring that he's won. He says he will only declare victory if he's won. And the president thinks he's winning in three crucial states: Pennsylvania, Florida, and Texas. First Lady Melania Trump has cast her vote, stopping in at a voting center in Palm Beach, Florida, close to the president's Mar-a-Lago resort. Asked why she didn't vote with her husband last week, the First Lady told reporters, quote, it's election day, so I wanted to come here to vote today for the election. The First Lady was the only person at the polling site at the time who was not wearing a mask. Meanwhile, states are prepared to call out the National Guard if needed to keep the peace as election results begin to come in this evening. Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker has ordered 1,000 members of the Guard to be on standby. National Guard troops also will be on standby in case there is more violence in Portland, Oregon. 10 states already have Guard members handling cybersecurity and routine election tasks. The number of deaths linked to COVID-19 in England and Wales rose 46% to a 4-month high in the week ending October 23rd. The numbers show how the disease was accelerating before the government's decision to impose a partial lockdown. COVID deaths accounted for more than 9% of all fatalities in England and Wales during the week. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so very much, Mark. Up next, we're going to talk with pollster John Zogby for his take on the election today. How confident are we really in the polls this time? We've seen them be wrong in the past, but do we think we have it right this time? At the same time, might we just get to see more young people showing up to vote than we've ever seen before? He recently has done an extensive survey of 18 to 24-year-olds for Forbes, and he's come up with some interesting conclusions about the young people in America and their increased participation in the political process. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, there may never have been as many polls done for any election in history. And when you have a lot of polls, that means you have a fair amount of variation in those polls. Welcome now one of the mainstays of the American polling profession. John Zogby started his first polling firm back in 1984, and since then he has worked with just about every important news organization in the country. Welcome now back to Bloomberg. So, John, thank you so much for being with us. So as you go into this election day, what are you looking at? Where are you nervous, if at all, about what the polls are telling us?
Well, we don't know who's voting today. We do know, according to the polls, that there's a huge red wave coming. Donald Trump supporters are going to come out. They're going to come out big time. And it all depends on whether there's enough of them to offset what has been an unprecedented, massive early voter turnout. We know from my polling anyway that among those early voters, they have a 17-point advantage for Joe Biden, and they're representing almost 2/3 of the expected total of votes. Donald Trump's got to win very big today to offset what has been the early voting disadvantage for him.
So, John, it may be too early to speculate or draw larger conclusions, but I really wonder if we do, and we don't know yet, but if we do have a record turnout, and people are talking about perhaps a percentage that's as high as we've had in the last over 100 years, frankly, in terms of percentage people turning out, might that really change the complexion, the demographics of who's voting? Because the country's changing. As you look at younger generations, you have more people of color.
Yes. Well, Barack Obama ushered in a new era of younger people voting. And of course, younger people at that point in time were, about 60% white and, about 40% non-white. We're looking at a situation today where 18 to 29-year-olds have even a larger percentage of non-white voters who heavily tilt Democrat. And therefore, those younger voters in total tend to be very Democrat. And so this election here, we're seeing lots of young people out there, lots of people of color who are out there to vote. This is what the future of the United States will be.
So talk about those younger voters, because I know you've done an extensive survey just recently on the younger generation. What have you learned that we should know that might surprise us?
Well, we know that they don't distrust government. They want their government to do good things. We know that they're driving the issue of race relations to the forefront of the issues in this campaign. And unlike the kids of the 60s, like myself, who marched for civil rights, we were marching for them. These kids are marching for each other. This is the least racial divide of any age cohort that we've ever had. In addition to that, they bring the issue of climate change into the top 6 issues in the campaign, simply by virtue of the fact that it's the number 2 issue after the economy for young people alone. The economy, climate change, and racial justice, all up there among the top issues for these young people.
John, I read a piece in the Wall Street Journal just today, you may have seen it, maybe not, suggesting why the polls may all be wrong. And it suggested a couple of things. It suggested, number one, that polls tend to undercount white males who do not have a college education, in part because saying, look, a lot of it's done by cell phone and they're not going to answer some call. They don't know what it is. And another that, in fact, it may be under-anticipating the extent to which African Americans, black voters, might actually vote for President Trump. Not a majority of them, but enough of a difference from what happened last time to really make the polls skew.
I have been researching and conducting online polls for 22 years now, and clearly the telephone, the landline telephone, the cell phone are becoming more and more obsolete as research tools. That's why when we do our online polls, I don't see any problem whatsoever getting white males, young black males, people of color. Yes, there's always going to be a slight underrepresentation of some of those groups, but the kind of representation large enough so that we can apply and adjust a weight to them. So I think that some pollsters are probably going to be embarrassed because they did miss some of these key demographics. I don't feel that we have. And frankly, there are young black males who are supporting Donald Trump, and that's lifting up his potential among black voters in general a little bit in this race.
And what about Latino voters?
Yeah, Latino voters, the same sort of thing. You've got young Latino males who, for a variety of cultural and ideological reasons, are voting Republican. Latinos, about 40% above the national average, identify themselves as conservatives. Nonetheless, we're looking at Joe Biden scoring among Latino voters pretty much what a Democrat can expect to score among them, and Donald Trump doing actually not as well as his predecessors, John McCain and Mitt Romney, both of whom did pretty poorly among Latino voters.
John, as a true expert in polling, as you look at this election right now, what is the toughest problem in the polling? I mean, I assume it's not national polls because, since Truman in 48 beat Dewey, the national polls have not been that far off, I don't think. But the state ones can to be. Is Pennsylvania the toughest nut to crack? Because it seems to be hard to get our arms around what's going on in Pennsylvania right now.
Well, I think we've got enough of our arms around Pennsylvania to know that it is, in fact, competitive. And that's about all that polls can tell you, whether they're a point off here, 2 points off there. Bottom line is Pennsylvania remains a pretty competitive state. As James Carville famously said, it's Pittsburgh and Philadelphia to the west and east, and a whole lot of Alabama in between. It is a land very much of moderate Republicans and conservative Democrats. So it kind of breaks the mold a little bit.
To what extent is it going to be harder to make any projections for the media because we don't have exit polls, essentially, I don't think, anymore. And it's very difficult to get our arms around the polling results from the past.
I never thought exit polls should project elections. Election polls are vital because they tell us who voted, why they voted the way they did. Otherwise, get out your popcorn and watch the results come in like everybody else.
Okay.
And this is a pollster talking, and is totally consistent with my entire career about exit polls.
As somebody who was a consumer of those exit polls back when I ran ABC News, I didn't trust them at all. They were useful on what we used to call the crosstabs, right? After the fact, to figure out what certain parts of the population or what they felt strongly about. But the exit polls themselves, there are just too many flaws with them, I think.
There are, not the least of which is today. So many people voted before the election. What good does it have somebody standing or sitting at a card table? Plus, we learned in 2004, in particular, when the exit polls really blew some states, that there could be a young mom as an exit poller in a suburb in Philadelphia, sitting with her small child and watching voters go by and say, and this actually happened, I'm supposed to ask questions of every seventh person who walks by, but, this is a little old lady, and I don't really want to bother her. Well, there you go. Yeah. That screws up everything.
Exactly. Garbage in, garbage out. Thank you so much, John. It's really great to talk to you as always. That's John Zogby. He's founder and senior partner of John Zogby Strategies. Coming up, we talk to a key Democratic player in the key state of Florida, Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Every 4 years, Florida looms large when it comes time to figure out who's going to be the next president. And this year is certainly no exception. Welcome now a key Democratic figure in Florida, Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who represents the 23rd Congressional District, including parts of Fort Lauderdale and southern Miami-Dade County. So, Congresswoman, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. We just lost your picture a little bit. Can you hear me, ma'am? Congressman Wasserman Schultz, can you hear me? Okay, we're going to try to get her back. In the meantime, let's go to a break. This is Bloomberg. We are back now with Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. The evil geniuses have done their work, and we got the technical glitch floating out. So she represents the 23rd Congressional District, including parts of Fort Lauderdale and Miami-Dade County. Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz also serves as Chief Deputy Whip. So glad we got you back. Thanks for being here, Congresswoman. Okay, give us a sense from the view from Florida right now, this election today.
Well, we're seeing increased turnout here for Election Day. My home county, Broward County, is the bluest county in the state, in the biggest swing state, and we are clocking in at about 71% turnout now. And our supervisor of elections is saying it's not impossible that we might get to 80% turnout by the end of the day. So between early vote and vote by mail and in-person voting today, so. That would be a record, and we're just obviously that we rack up the numbers here in Broward County, and it really bodes well for not only Biden-Harris but all the Democrats up and down the ballot. People are voting in robust numbers because they want change.
So, Congressman, address one thing. There was a report, Bloomberg had a report last Friday that some people in the Biden camp were concerned that you were not getting the Latino turnout that you really needed in South Florida. Is there any truth to that? Is there an issue? This is with the early voting.
Well, actually, going into the weekend, we did have a vote-by-mail lag in the African-American turnout in Miami-Dade County. That picked up significantly over the weekend. We finished vote-by-mail and early vote going into Election Day about 115,000 votes ahead of the Republicans. That's about 25,000 votes more ahead than we were going into Election Day in 2016. Now we've had 9 million votes cast statewide. That's significantly better, and we're really feeling good about the turnout across the state. There are long lines in Tampa. We have better than expected turnout in Broward and Miami-Dade counties today, both blue counties. And the Hispanic turnout we're expecting is going to be, is continuing to go well. And we're just making sure that we're all GOTV all the time. People should go out and vote, drop their vote-by-mail ballot off, which they can still do at a supervisor of elections location, drop it in a bin before 7 o'clock tonight, or vote in person at your precinct.
So all of us in the media are trying to be patient this year and not get ahead of ourselves, but we still are trying to anticipate a little bit. As I understand it, the final poll closings in Florida will be at 8 o'clock because you have the Panhandle. 7 o'clock for most of the state, right. 8 o'clock for the Panhandle. At the same time, you've been able to count, as I understand it, those early votes early. So do you expect we'll get a lot of those fairly soon after the 8 o'clock poll closing?
Yes, in Florida, our supervisors of elections are able to tabulate in advance of Election Day. So we expect that we will have the large majority of our votes will post, I would guess, around 9 o'clock, 9:30, because of the 8 o'clock Panhandle vote polls closing. And so you'll get a good sense of where we are this evening. And then, of course, we have to add the Election Day turnout as well. So there is every expectation that we will know how Florida has voted this, tonight, maybe late tonight. But and if it continues to go the way it has been, and the NPAs break our way, which we are feeling like many of the no-party affiliate voters that voted here are voting for Biden-Harris in robust numbers, as well as the Republicans. Let's not forget, there's plenty of Republicans that are exhausted and ashamed of this president and have gone to the polls and cast their vote for Joe Biden because they want change as well.
What about the military absentee ballots? Because in past elections, that sometimes has been an issue in Florida.
I've not heard anything about problems with the delivery of those ballots. In fact, even our rejection rate is at about 0.03%. So we're not seeing a lot of problems with votes being, canceled at the polls, where I know our party has an aggressive ballot curing program where if there's a problem with someone's signature or something's wrong that needs to be fixed, voters here have 48 hours following the submission of their vote, and a problem is identified to correct it so that their vote can count. And that process is going very well. So we're feeling really good.
Up here in the Northeast, there's concern about possible disruptions. I mean, we have some stores boarded up in New York City. You have them in Washington, D.C. We hope that nothing will happen, but people are preparing for that possibility. How orderly is it down in Florida? What are you seeing in the polling process?
I've only seen, and I've been out at the polls all day and all the way through the early voting process, and I've seen, the normal, let's say, overly enthusiastic poll workers, mostly on the Trump side, quite frankly. And so, the folks come out and calm everybody down. And so that's not been anything out of the ordinary. But really, Donald Trump's responsibility is to not foment civil unrest, but to make sure that there's calm and to accept the outcome of whatever the result is. And just let me stress that we aren't likely to know tonight who was elected president of the United States, because there are many states, like always, whose ballots come in after the election, because many states, unlike ours, can postmark their vote by mail ballot by election day, and then it's counted when it's received. So we're going to have to be patient, and Donald Trump needs to not make life harder and make the outcome of this election more difficult and fan the flames of civil unrest, because he may not like the eventual outcome.
Okay, Congresswoman, thank you very much, and thanks for your patience with those technical problems as well. That's Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. Americans continue to turn out in huge numbers to cast their ballots in this election. The Elections Project says more than 100 million Americans have already voted, and by the time polls close tonight, the Department of Homeland Security estimates that number will be 150 million. Americans may not know who will be sworn in as president next January for days or weeks if a tight race in battleground states prompts judicial challenges over late arriving ballots. They may have tried, but no foreign hackers successfully meddled in the 2020 elections here in the United States. That today from Acting Homeland Security Secretary Chad Wolf. He says officials remain on high alert for any interference by foreign actors, including Russia, China, and Iran. President Trump has repeatedly challenged the U.S. intelligence community's finding that Russia tried to influence the 2016 election in his favor. As David mentioned a moment ago, retailers are bracing for potential violence in the wake of the election. Store owners here in Manhattan, Washington, and in other cities have boarded up their windows. In Beverly Hills, police are closing Rodeo Drive today and tomorrow. In the UK, officials have raised the terrorist threat level to severe, meaning an attack on the UK is highly likely. Officials say the step was taken as a precaution and was not based on a specific plot against Britain. Police say deadly incidents in France and Austria in recent weeks prompted that move. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. Arizona was once known as a reliably Republican state. It hasn't voted for a Democratic candidate for president since Bill Clinton won back in 1996. But the face of Arizona politics is changing. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow is covering the Arizona race for us from Phoenix. So, Ed, great to have you with us. Give us a sense of how different Arizona is in 2020 from what it was in 2016. I'm sorry, I'm not hearing Ed. I think that we lost another technical difficulties, not just with Congressman Wasserman Schultz, but also with Ed Ludlow. As I say, he's in Phoenix because Arizona is a key state in this race, not only for the presidential race, but also for that Senate race where we have Mark Kelly, the former astronaut, going up against a former the first combat pilot, actually, who is the current senator from Arizona. So we're out in Arizona to figure out what's going on. At the same time, as I was suggesting to Ed, there's been a fundamental change, particularly in Maricopa County, which is by far the largest county in the state. It is where Phoenix is located, and Maricopa County has changed fundamentally in who lives there, the demographics of who lives there, both the age as well as the race and ethnicity, and also apparently in their orientation to certain issues, such as, for example, immigration. What had once been decidedly conservative now seems to be much more purple, although depending on whether you talk to a Democrat or a Republican in the state of Arizona, they'll say it tends toward the red or it tends toward the blue. It will be a key race if former Vice President Biden is to hope to take over the presidency. Obviously, the route for him this time is to make sure he holds all the states that had gone for Hillary Rodham Clinton last time, plus add certain. And in most books, Arizona is one of the key states that he wants to add. Plus, of course, turn around Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, if at all possible, if he's going to hope to get to the 270 electoral votes, which are essential if he's going going to become the next president of the United States. At the same time, President Trump is certainly fighting hard for Arizona, as he is for Nevada as well, the adjoining state of Nevada, which has gone Democrat in recent years. And yet President Trump has some hopes, he thinks, of actually turning that back to red and winning Nevada as well. It's part of the jigsaw across the entire country. And now I'm told we do have Ed Ludlow. I'm glad, it's worth the effort. Ed, I'm sorry. I've been vamping and not doing nearly as good a job as you have. What I asked actually was, how is Arizona different today than it was 4 years ago?
Yeah, an issue of demographics. You know, Democrats are certainly hoping that a more educated electorate, a higher proportion of Latino voters, a growing Asian population, an influx of Californians and tech workers will be in their favor because they're inclined to vote on more liberal issues and vote for Democrat. Although that said, the Republicans and President Trump have really focused on the economic message here, specifically tied to COVID and how they were able to reopen the economy in June and July. And if you talk to small business owners, they talk favorably of Trump and the Republicans because they are perhaps tourism-focused businesses or leisure industry-focused businesses, and they were pleased at the pace of reopening. Beyond that, the central issue is, of course, COVID. In healthcare, we crossed 6,000 deaths in the state this morning, close to 250,000 cases. And basically, Democrats are saying that the president and the Republican Party have acted irresponsibly. President Trump did pressure Governor Ducey to open quickly in June and July, at which point you saw Arizona become one of the hot spots and epicenters of rising cases here in the United States.
Ed, just give us a moment or two on the Senate race, which is terribly important out there as well.
Yeah, it's a great chance for the Democrats to return 2 senators to Washington from Arizona for the first time in the 1950s. As you said, Mark Kelly, a former astronaut, he's really ran a centrist platform, often invoking John McCain and his ability to work across the aisle. His opponent, Martha McSally, lost to Kirsten Sinema in the 2018 midterms, but was then appointed by Ducey to the McCain vacant seat. And she's often used the line that Kelly would bring a liberal focus to the state. But again, Kelly's focus is very much being a centrist. And the Democrats that I've spoken to in the last 24 hours say that they really think Kelly is going to give them a boost down ballot as well. He often encourages voters to look down ballot and has a good handle on local issues here in Maricopa County, but also Arizona more broadly. So Democrats that I've spoken to are feeling very positive today. Republicans are feeling a little nervous because they think that there may have been some bleed from more moderate Republican voters towards Mark Kelly at the Senate level and again towards Biden statewide.
And one piece of good news is Arizona knows how to deal with absentee ballots. They have a lot of them every single election. Ed Ludlow of Bloomberg News. He's going to be part of our election special. That starts at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Television and Radio. And this is Bloomberg.